And I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. But we must bring him right up beside us before we spring this trap. That will test our nerve. And discipline will count just as much as courage.
The Age of Fighting Sail. Part 10. The Battle of the Nile. By anchoring his ships only at the bow, Bruys had invited defeat. The French ships had been anchored up against the shoals of the west bank while the wind was from the east. But now the wind was from the northwest. The ships had swung around so that there was deep water in between them and the shoals. Had they been anchored at the stern as well as the bow, they would not have swung. Foley's map confirmed his assumptions that there was deep water between the French line and the shallows inside the line. Foley knew what tactic to use, and he did not bother to query the flagship because he was sure that Nelson had spotted Bruys' mistake just as he had. He was right. The Vanguard's flag captain, Sir Edward Barry, later recorded that Nelson in that moment studied the French line with an eye of a seaman determined on attack, and it instantly struck his eager and penetrating mind that where there was room for an enemy ship to swing, there was room for one of ours to anchor. Nelson now sent up his favorite signal, a red pennant over a blue flag, meaning, engage the enemy more closely. The cheers could be heard through the fleet and across the bay. Some French sailors tried to answer, but their cheers sounded half-hearted at best, and they could also hear the derisive laughter from Nelson's men. Listening to this exchange, Nelson realized that while the French tactic of firing at British rigging and then making an escape had its merits in preserving ships, it had the disadvantage of breeding the attitude of prey instead of that of predator. He hoisted no more signals. No more were needed. Aboard the Goliath, Foley gave a quick order to his helmsman. The Goliath went across the bow of the leading French ship, the Guerrier, raking her with the first broadside of the battle. Foley rounded the French line, turned and went in between it and the shore. He discovered that the Guerrier's captain had compounded his commander's mistake. Expecting to be attacked only on his outward side, he had let his crew stack piles of crates, gear, and other impediments on his landward decks. The French sailors scrambled to clear the landward guns. While they did, Foley let go another rain of cannonballs, smashing the Guerrier's sides open, knocking out most of her landward guns, and killing most of the crews with a shower of splinters. Foley's plan was to drop a stern anchor alongside the Guerrier, but his anchor cable ran out a bit too far, and the Goliath moved down the line until Foley drew up opposite of the next ship in the French line, the Conquérant. He opened fire on her, and in perfect coordination, Nelson's other captains adapted their tactics. Around the head of the French line came the Zealous and the Theseus. The Zealous dropped anchor alongside the steel-reeling Guerrier. Miller in the Theseus ordered his guns loaded with double and triple the regular single round of shot and rowed across the Guerrier's bow until her masts were in line. He then opened up with such effect that a second breath could not be drawn before her main and mizzenmasts were gone. Miller then deftly took the Theseus around the anchored Zealous and Goliath to attack the third French ship, the Spartiate, before directing his guns to the Aquilon and the Conquérant on either side of the Spartiate. Saumarez's Orion added to the damage to the Guerrier, sending another broadside into her splintered bow before running inside and down the French line to anchor on the quarter of the Pupille Savran, and on the bow of the Franklin, sixth in the French line. As surprised by the British tactics as the men aboard the Guerrier, the captain of the French frigate Sirius, lying in the shallow water next to the shore, made a desperate attempt to foil the British maneuver. He opened fire on the Goliath. It was a rash intervention. Frigates were used as scouts and message carriers and did not usually add their meager firepower to that of the ships of the line. The Sirius paid for her captain's sin. Foley was outraged by the impertinence. He ordered his men to sink that brute, and his guns opened fire on the frigate, followed by the guns of the oncoming Orion. The Sirius slowly sank, her men scrambling up the rigging as the hull settled into the shallow water. To make the envelopment perfect, after the Audacious had rounded the French line to the inside, Nelson and the rest of his fleet attacked the French from the outward side. The van and center of Bruys' line were thus surrounded and attacked from both sides, and the entire British fleet was concentrated on the forward half of the French line. The entire British fleet except one. In the most frustrating episode of his career, Captain Troubridge took the Culloden too close to the shoals of Aboukir Island at the bay's entrance and ran aground. For the rest of the night he fought his own battle with the shoal and did not get free until morning. His only consolation was that in the darkness his lights served as beacons to help other ships from running onto the same shoal. The rest of the British were earning their victory. French had been hurt badly in the first hour of the battle. Every one of the first 8 ships in the French line was raked by 2 British ships. But Napoleon's navy fought back with desperate determination. Aboard Foley's Goliath, the thump of cannonballs, followed by the shower of splinters, rocked the ship and cut down most of the men on the upper deck. Below the gun decks, the acrid smoke soon made everything nearly invisible. The smoke spread across the water, and the enemies could be seen only by flashing red tongues of fire from their guns. Below the gun decks, John Nichol, the cooper, had been assigned to help pass out powder instead of manning a gun. Deep in the orlop deck, he could only listen to the roar and crash of the battle above. There were some women on the Goliath, smuggled on board by their husbands and lovers. Nichol recalled that they behaved as well as the men. One of them was the gunner's wife, who did her part by bringing the men some wine every now and then to lessen their fatigue. A woman from Leith was killed. Another from Edinburgh, no doubt stimulated by the excitement, went into labor. While lives were being snuffed out on the decks above, a new life was born below. It was a boy, a true son of a gun. A woman named Nancy Pyrrham helped the surgeon in the cockpit of the Orion. She never forgot one instance with a young midshipman, a protege of Captain Saumarez, who was brought below with his arm blown out of its socket. She later recalled the boy bore the operation without a murmur, and then when it was over, he turned to me and he said, "Have I not borne it like a man?" Having said this, he immediately expired. Nichol remembered 2 other gruesome oddities. A young gunner was about to light his match to a gun when he was hit by a ball that came right through the Goliath's gunport. The shot took off most of his arm and it hung by a small piece of skin, and then the match fell to the deck. He looked to his arm and, seeing what had happened, seized the match in his left hand and fired off the gun, then staggered off to the surgeon in the cockpit below. The other boy Nichol noticed was sitting on a cartridge chest and did not jump when ordered to. The gunner gave him a shove and the boy tumbled onto the deck and lay still. He had been killed by the percussion of a cannon, and there was not a mark on him. The boy was dumped overboard and the firing went on. On the quarterdeck of the Theseus, Captain Ralph Miller had a bad moment when he realized that the broadsides of 3 French ships of the line bore directly on his ship. In the haze and confusion, the French ships did not fire. Miller ordered his gunners below decks to also cease their fire. Those gunners were puzzled by the order, but Miller was resolved to remain quiet as long as the French remained quiet as well. By 9 p.m., the French van was all but out of action. The Conquérante had struck her colors, and the dismantled Guerrier was about to. Darkness had settled over the bay, shattered by the stabbing light of gunfire and illuminated by an occasional flaming sail or fire on deck. Most of the ships were fully hidden in the roiling clouds of smoke, with only their masts visible in the flashes of light. The British had an extra advantage because Nelson had the foresight to order white instead of blue ensigns, and a horizontal row of blue lights at the mizzen of each of his ships for easier identification in the darkness. Still, the smoke swirled over all of the ships in blinding banks. And to a gun crew captain, the scene was often merely a cloud of smoke out of which the ghostly form of a ship might suddenly appear. A reddened moon appeared over the eastern sand dunes. As it rose, it revealed an inferno of smoke and fire, in which the British and French kept up their cannon fire. Bruey's flagship, the Orient, was in the center of the line. The British attack was now closing on her, and her decks were whistling with shot. A sliver of shrapnel had struck Bruey's in the head. It was merely a flesh wound, and he used his kerchief to wipe away the blood. Another piece of shot hit him in the body. Then a cannonball ripped off his left thigh, nearly cutting him in 2. Still, he would not go below. He ordered his aides to prop him up against a chest, saying, "A French admiral should die on his quarterdeck." He continued to direct the defense, but gradually weakened until he fainted from the loss of blood. He died shortly after, with the same tranquility of soul that he had always shown in combat. Just before Brueys received his first wound, Nelson paced his own quarterdeck, and the vanguard exchanged broadsides with the Spartiate. Even though the French ship had been attacked on her other side by the Theseus, her gun crews fought so well that the vanguard was badly mauled. Then the Minotaur came to the vanguard's aid. It took 3 British men of war to subdue the Spartiate. Nelson was already planning his attack on the rear of the French line. He stopped pacing to study a crude map of the bay, and at that point was hit in the forehead by a piece of langrage, the scrap shot fired by the French to cut the enemy sails. He started to fall and was caught by Barry, his flag captain. Barry led his commander, now blinded by the blood running down his face, down the ladders, through the smoky echoing gun decks, back into the cockpit. The surgeon looked up from the operating table and started toward them. But Nelson had regained his composure. He waved the surgeon away, saying he would wait his turn. When the surgeon finally did get to him, he found the wound to be bloody but superficial. The piece of iron had revealed Nelson's cranium for an inch over the unseeing right eye. But the wound was 3 inches long, and a flap of flesh had fallen over his good eye. The surgeon folded the flap back in place, used strips of adhesive to hold it, and wound a bandage around Nelson's skull. Barry led the Admiral into the bread room, a cavernous storage space near the cockpit, and told him to lie down. For a while he lay quiet, but within minutes he was asking for John Campbell, his secretary, to take down his report on the battle. Campbell had himself been wounded, and the sight of Nelson with the reddening bandage around his head was too much for him. His hands shook so badly that he could not write. Nelson sent him away. At 9:30, Barry came below again. The battle was a magnificent sight at this point, he reported. There were fires throughout the French fleet, and the biggest fire was on the Orient. Nelson got to his feet and insisted on going on deck. Barry led him up the ladders, past the thundering guns and cheering gunners, onto the vanguard's quarterdeck. The scene was undeniably spectacular. An acrid yellow cloud hung over everything, and the falling ashes of 100 fires made a gritty sound underfoot as Nelson and Barry walked on the deck. Around them the water was filled with spars, barrels, and bodies, and the sounds of guns was punctuated by the splash and hiss of cannonballs hitting the water. But the focus of the conflagration was the towering Orient. On the afternoon before the battle, her crew had been painting her, and they had not the time to jettison all the paint buckets. So the first few broadsides had ignited fires all over the ship. As she began to burn, 5 British ships within range directed their line of fire at her. The flagship's tall mainmast crashed over the side in a geyser of water. The mizzenmast followed. As Nelson looked across the water at her, the Orient seemed to be consuming herself. It would not be long before the fire reached her powder magazines. At that point she would explode like a gigantic bomb. Clearly her officers and crew realized this too. An ensign named Lachenede later recalled, after incredible but futile efforts, we left the bridge deck, which was covered with flaming corpses. The ship was burning fore and aft, and already the flames were reaching the 24-pounder battery. And yet, in the 36-pounder battery, the men seemed to be unaware of the danger, and they continued to fire vigorously. With Brueys dead, his chief of staff assembled the remaining officers. While fires crackled outside the admiral's cabin, they agreed to flood the Orient's hold. But the fire moved faster than the water came in. The chief of staff gave the order to abandon the ship. The wounded men were left to burn. From the Vanguard's deck, the abandonment of the Orient was an odd sight. The lowest tier of guns still firing as a rolling carpet of humanity poured over the ship's side into the water. Nelson asked if any of the Vanguard's boats were still serviceable. Only one was. He ordered it sent to pick up survivors from the Orient. At that point, the fire reached the Orient's powder magazine. The explosion shook every ship in the bay. The Orient became one huge ball of fire. There was then a stunning stillness. Every gun fell silent as the gunners watched the spectacle of burning spars, sails, and bodies showering into the hissing water. After some minutes, guns took up again and the battle continued. Amid the floating wreckage and bobbing heads where the Orient had been, A few British boats tried to rescue survivors. Of the Orient's 1,000 men, only 60 were saved. One survivor made it on his own. Captain Ben Hallowell of the Swiftsure was taken aback when confronted by a dripping man naked except for a French cocked hat on his head. It was Lieutenant Charles Berthelot of the Orient, and he explained that he had been commanding the lower deck guns when the overhead beams fell through. After stripping his smoldering uniform and abandoning ship with the gunners, the lieutenant climbed back through another gun port and found his hat. Without it, he reasoned, he would not be recognized as an officer and a gentleman. The Battle of the Nile went on through the night, with the French fighting bravely and desperately. Captain Alexandre Thevenard of the Aquilon lost both legs to a cannonball hit. Captain Aristide Dupit-Thouars of the Tonnant also had both legs shot off. He refused to go below, ordered tourniquets put on his stumps, and had a barrel of bran brought on deck. Seated on the barrel, he continued to give orders while his lifeblood seeped away. Finally, he said to his lieutenant, "I might lose my head along with my blood and do something foolish if I keep the command. It is time I give up." With his pistol, he then blew out his own brains. The Tonnant's men fought on without him until she was a mastless hull, with 120 men killed, 150 wounded, and 1,600 survivors of other French ships crowding her decks. Shortly after dawn, the last guns ceased firing. Sunrise revealed a watery battlefield of smoking wreckage, where the evening before there had been 2 stately lines of warships. There was now a tangled mess of jagged masts and floating hulks. John Nichol, climbing on deck from his post below, was awed. He later recalled that the whole bay was covered with dead bodies, mangled, wounded, and scorched. Of Napoleon's grand fleet, 6 ships of the line had struck their colors. The flagship was on the bottom of the bay, and 4 others were grounded on the beach. 2 more, which had been stationed at the rear of the French line and were therefore undamaged, now made their escape. Hood and the Zealous tried to go after them, but no other ship was in condition to assist in the chase, so he was recalled. One of the fugitives was the Guillaume Tell, flagship of Rear Admiral Pierre Villeneuve, commander of the French rear. Villeneuve would meet Nelson again at Trafalgar. By contrast, not a single British ship had been lost, but there was scarcely one with all its masts. The stiff human price paid by both sides amounted to nearly 2,000 dead, including at least 1,700 French and more than 200 British. Aboukir Island, the site of Brueys' useless battery, was used for a burial ground where French and British, including the woman killed aboard the Goliath, were buried together in the armistice of death, and all commemorated with a single cross. It was more than 2 weeks before all the British ships were repaired, many of them with parts salvaged from the wrecked enemy vessels. At last, on August 17th, Nelson sent 7 of the British ships and 6 of the French prizes to Gibraltar, under the command of Saumarez. 2 days later, with 2 of his men of war, Nelson took the vanguard to Naples. 3 ships were left behind to continue the blockade of the harbors and keep the trap sprung on Napoleon. Months later, Nelson received a ghoulish souvenir of the battle. Captain Hallowell sent aboard the flagship a handsome coffin built from pieces of the Orient's mainmast that Hallowell's boats had salvaged. Nelson was utterly delighted with it. He had stood it on end behind his chair in his dining cabin until his manservant Tom Allen could stand it no longer. He persuaded Nelson to have it stowed below until it could be taken back to England to await him there. The Battle of the Nile was the most devastating naval victory in the 18th century. Tactically, it demonstrated that England's new admirals and captains were revolutionizing the old methods of naval warfare. Strategically, it proved that the Royal Navy was at last rising to the challenge that had been mounting since 1770. The challenge would continue to rise and would threaten England's very shores, but in the Mediterranean at least, the tide had turned in Britain's favor. It was 13 days after the battle before the news reached Napoleon on the edge of the Sinai Desert. Upon hearing the news, Napoleon dismounted from his horse and walked out alone into the desert, where he stood gazing in the direction of the coast. As he walked away from them, his aides claimed to have heard him say, "So this is the end of my navy. Can it be that I am fated to perish in Egypt?" Shortly thereafter, he walked back to his assembled officers and attempted to make light of the situation, exhorting his troops to greater efforts on land. Of Admiral Brueys, Napoleon said, "He did well to die." On August 19th, the same day that Nelson sailed for Naples, Napoleon wrote a letter of consolation to Brueys' widow. In it he wrote, "He died honorably and without suffering, as every soldier would wish to die. Your sorrow touches me to the quick. I want you to count as of some value my friendship and the lively interest that I shall always take in the wife of my friend." On the same day, he also wrote to the Directory in Paris, blaming the disaster on the incompetence of Admiral Brueys.